Well, good afternoon. I have nothing to disclose. So when I finished my fellowship in Oregon at Oregon Health and Science Center, I was fortunate to go to the University of Texas and Memorial Hermann and join Fred Moore and Chris Kokenar, who you guys heard earlier today, and Rosemary Kozar as partners. And I can say as a junior faculty member, you really couldn't ask for better partners and better mentors from that perspective. When I was first talking to Fred, and we were talking about professional development and things of that nature, Fred's like, well, you've got to join Southwestern Surgical Congress. And that was kind of a must in Fred's eyes from that perspective. To be honest, I'd given a couple talks as a resident at Southwest Surgical Congress, so I had a little bit of an idea about the society, but I didn't know a whole lot about the society. And when I started preparing for this talk, I kind of went to the website just to look more to refresh my memory. And here's kind of what the purpose of the Southwest Surgical Congress is. It's really to promote and advance general surgery. And we're not just talking about general surgery for the academicians or the community surgeons, but also the rural surgeons. It's also in place for residents and medical students, fellows, and things of that nature. And the key tenets of Southwestern Surgical Congress are these four. It's education, advocacy, research, and innovation. And through all of this, we promote excellence in patient care and professional development. When you look at the origins of the Southwestern Surgical Congress, it really started with Walter Stuck of San Antonio. And this all came to be at a meeting of the Southeastern Surgical Congress in 1948. And he was chatting with Drs. Beasley and Sanders, and they kind of came up with this idea for the Southwestern Surgical Congress. Interesting enough, at that point in time, the Southwest United States was the only part of the country that did not have a regional surgical society, and that's why they drafted this concept. So in my mindset, they saved the best for last, but I'm probably a little biased on that front. And it's really through Southwest Surgical Congress that I got to know Clay, through this society and other societies I've worked with. And I consider Clay a great friend and a good colleague and a great mentor. And so Clay, thank you so much for asking me to give this lectureship. It's really an honor, so thank you. When you look at Southwest Surgical Congress, there are three named lectureships that come up every year. And the first one we heard this morning by Christine Kokenar, the Poth Lectureship, it was derived in 1975 and honoring him as the 15th president. The Orr Lectureship came about in 1966, and Dr. Orr was the second president, and I'll speak more to him in a second. And the third named lectureship is the Claude H. Organ Lectureship that came up in 1996, and really to honor him for his dedication to Southwest Surgical, and also just as to general surgery and surgery as a whole. Dr. Orr specifically was born in 1884. He was born in Carrollton, Missouri. And for undergrad, he went to the University of Missouri, then went to Johns Hopkins, which Dr. Poth did too, I learned this morning from what Chris said, and went to medical school at Johns Hopkins, then went to the University of Kansas in 1910, and quickly rose through the ranks to professor by 1924, and was a full professor and was the chair in the Department of Surgery for the next 25 years until he stepped down as chair in the Department of Surgery. He was one of the charter members of the American Board of Surgery, and nationally he also rose to the ranks of president of the ASA, so a quite accomplished academician and leader in the surgical community back in the day. He had over 200 publications, innumerable book chapters, and even some textbooks, and this was the second edition of Operations of General Surgery, which was one of the textbooks that he edited. Interestingly enough, he's held in high regard back at the University of Kansas, or KU, and they have the Orr Academic Society, and this is the logo. It's kind of a play on a lot of things. There's a scalpel, and if you notice, it crosses the caduceus, but that's on an oar, kind of an homage to his name as a play on words. And reading about the blue O is for O from Orr, and then you obviously have the sunflower and the jayhawk representing the University of Kansas and Kansas State. So a lot of homage to him back at the University of Kansas. Then looking at the list of speakers who've given this lectureship, it's quite a varied but very impressive list of speakers, and quite a few of whom I consider friends, and actually several of them here in the audience today. And so the next thing I did, I kind of emailed Clay one day, probably last spring, and said, Clay, what do you want me to talk about? And Clay just said, anything you want. And that's kind of the worst situation you can be in, because it just kind of leads you nowhere to go. And you can see these are some of the past topics we had recently. One was on privileging, and it ranged all the way to diarrhea, which anyone that goes through the privileging process as much as I have realized that those are almost one and the same, privileging and diarrhea. But there's a multitude of topics out there that people have gone through when they've actually discussed their lectureship. And so what I chose to speak about was planning and performance under stress. And I'll try to tie all that together for you as we go through the next 20 or so minutes. I think all of us as surgeons realize there are a multitude of stressors we face. And they can be in the operating room, and that's pretty obvious. You can be in the operating room, it's a very stressful situation. It doesn't necessarily help to have Dr. Maddox looking over your shoulder while you're doing a popliteal artery injury repair, but that's just one of those stressors. When we think about it on the job, there's environmental stressors and environmental issues. We live in a very complex and dynamic environment, and it's changing all the time, and that could be in the trauma bay, it could be in the operating room, it could be on the wards or in the ICU. We deal with imperfect, often ambiguous information, and this just may be the poor historian who's our patient. It might be the radiographic imaging not giving us all the details we want, but we also often don't have perfect information. We deal in a world where teamwork is critical, and we're dependent on all those people that play in the operating room with us, on the wards or in the ICU, and we don't control a lot of that, but we have to figure out how to get the most out of those team members and make it a success. We all have time constraints. Obviously, the residents have more significant time constraints now with 80 hours. Our staff and employees have time constraints, and we're really working in a high-stakes environment. And I often tell the residents, unfortunately, you chose to be a surgeon. You're not flipping hamburgers. You can't toss one away when you burn one. So it is high stakes, and from that standpoint, it leads a lot of stress on us. From a personal perspective, we have a lot of tasks also that bring us to a challenge. One is task saturation. I think for most surgeons, if you're a successful surgeon, you're the ultimate multitasker, taskmaster. You're doing multiple things at one time, and that's the only way you get through it. There's pressure to perform, and this comes in many facets. It might be academic, publications. More so and more so now, it's in being productive from a financial responsibility perspective, from an RVU perspective. We often deal with fatigue, and that's commonplace to all of us. And then we have those interpersonal relationships. Like I said, they're variable personalities we deal with, and you have to be able to work with those folks and get the most out of them and the most success out of them. And it really all comes together in a specialized cross-functional dependency. And so I think that's just in the routine world. So that's as everything's going planned. But I would assume in the room, all this sounds very familiar to everyone. We all deal with this on a daily basis. But then you take a more stressful situation. You take a trauma bay where you have multiple traumas coming in simultaneously and trying to manage those patients. Or you have this patient who's been stabbed multiple times in the abdomen and still has a knife sticking out of the box, and what do you do with this patient? You have patients in the operating room who have been very challenging cases, and you can witness that by the blood all over. And you have patients such as this that now have an open abdomen, an open chest, and a presumed aortic cross clamp sitting at the aorta on some point in time there. So it's really in these situations where we're really tried and really put under ultimate stress, and how do we perform in those situations? And I'll tell you, it's not really the technical skills that are that critical. All of us are technicians, but there's so much more to what we do than the technical concepts. And I would argue we could probably take anyone through a surgical procedure and teach them how to do it effectively. They may not be the best, but we could still work with them on the technical skills. But it really are what we call the non-technical skills of surgery. And I would presume most of the folks in this room have seen this or heard about the non-technical skills in surgery, better known as NOTS. And we really started instituting and implementing this at the Ben Taub Hospital back in July of this year of 16, and started working with the NOTS curriculum and trying to have a NOTS conference on a routine basis. And I will be honest, it's in its infancy. But when we're talking about NOTS, really, like I said, we're talking about the non-technical skills that really lead to good surgical practice. And it's much further than just being a good technician. The NOTS curriculum really developed from surgeons, sociologists, psychologists, and anesthetists. And it came out of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh and the NIH in Scotland. And they were the first ones that developed NOTS. And you might say, well, why now? Why are we focusing on this now? We've been training surgeons for forever. Well, there's several reasons. And one is we really do have a shifting education paradigm. The 80-hour work week was a game changer for us. In Europe, the 48-hour work week is even a bigger game changer for them, I believe. We have more specialization. You know, you have the 5-0 programs, or 0-5 programs, I should say. So there's a lot of difference in how we train residents. We're going more and more to competency-based training. So it's not so much as taking a number of tests and passing them. It's actually committing yourself and really revealing that you really are competent in what you're doing, and that's how advancement's going to go. And then we're focused on how to provide maximal and safe care for our patients overall. A more important thing is that many adverse event analyses, and we'll talk more about this later, reveal that the underlying cause often has nothing to do with the technical aspects of the procedure. It's the non-technical aspects. So what we're seeing is technical skills alone may not be enough to get us through what we're trying to get through either in the operating room, the ICU, the wards, the clinics, or whatnot. There's so much more to what we're doing beyond that from that perspective. Sorry about that. So furthermore, if you think about traditional training and how it functions, it really was there to teach us knowledge, to teach us clinical experience, and technical skills. The non-technical skills, I think everyone in this room that's more senior has been taught them, but it's been in a much more tacit manner and not a very formalized manner. So that's what we're trying to do with the non-technical skills. When you talk about the non-technical skills, these are the four large categories: situational awareness, decision-making, communication and teamwork, and leadership. And each of these categories has 3 elements underneath them. So you have a total of 12 non-technical skills. And those elements are gathering information, then processing and understanding that information, projecting and anticipating future states, considering options, selecting and communicating those options, implementing decisions, exchanging information, establishing shared understanding and coordinating team activities, and then under leadership, setting and maintaining standards, supporting others, and coping with pressure. The one thing I will say, the NOTS curriculum, when you look at it, really is intended for the operating room. But I think when you look at these 12 elements, you can see where these can play anywhere. They can play in the trauma bay, they can play in the ICU. It's just not the operating from that perspective in my mind. If you really get into a true NOTS curriculum and scoring system, they each have 4 scores, 4 being good and 1 being poor and some being non-applicable. But we really won't go into too much detail on that, but I will kind of walk through situational awareness and how they look at it. They're different, the 3 different elements I mentioned, one being gathering information. And they kind of come to you and say, these are good behaviors and these are bad behaviors. So good behaviors might be having a checklist beforehand and making sure you have all the data you need. Ensuring that any relevant radiographic studies were done preoperatively and you've looked at those. And then also liaison with your anesthetist to get them on board with what you're doing. Whereas poor behaviors, and we've all seen both sides of this, are showing up at the operating room late. Maybe not communicating with your anesthesiologist and letting them know what's going on. You know, if you look at it from a understanding information, really assessing those images you have preoperatively and then determining what they mean and where that takes you from an operative perspective versus possibly just overlooking those studies altogether or misinterpreting those data points from that perspective. And lastly, practicing and anticipating future states. And this is one of the most challenging things I see for residents in the operating room is thinking ahead 3 to 5 steps and letting the scrub tech or the anesthesiologist know what's going to be happening. Getting them on board before you get there versus waiting towards you getting bleeding or a complication like that that is highly predictable and not everyone in the room is ready for that situation. So really, those are the kind of the overview of NOTS, but so how do we apply this and how do we get this into our practice? This was a 2015 study looking at advances in teaching and assessing the non-technical skills. And I know some of these are going to be kind of small for you, so I'll tell you what they say, but overall, to have a best practice for non-technical skills curriculum, you really need to have a blended approach. You want to develop and follow a very distinctive curriculum, how it's going to look at your institution, and it may vary by institution to institution, and then you really want to implement a structure that's already been tested, and the NOTS is one of those structures. And we'll talk more about that, but there are innumerable topics out there looking at this. And then you really have to invest in faculty development. I would hazard guess the majority of the faculty in this room have had 0 training in this, definitely not in a formal fashion. It's very much in that tacit manner that all of us learned as residents, but we weren't taught this stuff. It's just stuff you kind of picked up by watching. So you might say, well, why is all this important? It sounds good, but what does it do for me and why is it important? And there are innumerable data looking at that also. This was from the VA health system, and they show that basically by having a NOTS curriculum and comparing it to a hospital that didn't have a curriculum, you had an 18% reduction in mortality versus 7% reduction, which was statistically significant. From an overview perspective, if you repeat that performance, you once again decrease mortality. So it's not a one-time offering. It really is an ongoing offering that you have to continue throughout the process, and you can't just stop after the first time. The last bullet really shows you that you also had a decrease in morbidity, 15% to 10%, which was equally significant from that perspective. So there are real meanings to our patients out there when we look at providing this type of curriculum with our residents overall. That being said, it's not easy to implement, and I think we've struggled with certain elements of it, there's no doubt. I mean, we haven't even gone full throttle, so to speak. But the real challenge is, I think one of the biggest ones is, number one, the lack of awareness of importance, and I'll allude to that later, but I think many people don't really think this is an important aspect of training for surgical residents, or probably an important aspect of training for us as clinicians actively practicing. A lack of resources, it does cost money, and it does take time, more importantly, and it takes effort. You're going to have some champion who's going to champion that at your institution. The cost of maintaining training, and then lastly, having faculty and educators who are really facile in determining how to function in this format. And that's probably the most challenging aspect also, is really getting people on board that know what they're doing. This was a follow-up study, and this is also from 2016. looking at training tools for non-technical skills for surgeons, and they looked at a systematic review. And this is actually really kind of interesting when you look at it. I think it's kind of a hot topic right now when you talk about knots and you talk about coaching and things of that nature, and the literature is really coming out on this in great fortitude right now. But when you look at it, they started off with 14,000 titles they looked at when they started looking at knots curriculum and this type of training in surgical education. 14,000 titles, that's pretty impressive. Now when they whittled it all the way down to their Prisma, they came down to 84 articles, but that's still a pretty large number of articles looking at this non-technical skills for surgeons. Out of those 84 articles, they have 23 different skills curriculums out there. So knots is one of them, but there are another 22 out there that people are using. So it's pretty fascinating to me when you look at it from that perspective. These bars, trust me, it's hard to read this even in the paper itself, but the bottom bars, the most important thing is the tallest bar represents medical students and residents and fellows. So most of these curriculum are focusing on our trainees. The small bars all over the right, those are actually focusing on us as attendings. So that's for the faculty in practice, that's for the community surgeon, et cetera. So what it's saying is we're really focusing this on our trainees, but not on lifelong learning from an attending perspective or a surgeon perspective. And we'll talk more about that shortly. What they did determine was knots, which is a curriculum we've been talking about, and a second curriculum known as Oxford No Text 2 are probably the two standard bearers or gold standards if you're going to do non-technical skills training for your residents or fellows. And that's really what we should be focusing on. This too was another study, and all it really did is said, how do we institute this algorithm? You know, where do we focus this? And once again, you can see they said focus on medical students, focus on foundational training, so your surgical residents, and specialist training. Focus on your specialists or your fellows from that perspective. There's no mention of attending surgeons, faculty surgeons, anywhere really in this from this perspective to a great extent, especially when you go read the manuscript. But this is the most interesting article to me, saying non-technical skills of surgical trainees and experienced surgeons. So in this manuscript, they took surgical trainees, being junior residents in their 1 through 3 years, then they took senior residents and fellows in their 4 on years in their fellowship. They compared to surgeons in practice, surgeons who had been in practice less than 20 years and those over 20 years. And the results are not necessarily surprising to me, but are still pretty impressive. Don't expect you to be able to see this, but what I can tell you is out of all 12 technical skills, more experienced surgeons performed more poorly than junior residents in every single one of the elements, and they were all statistically significantly different from that perspective. So we did worse as we got older, routinely over time and time again. This one here, once again, not to look at it, but if you look at all 12 of these boxes, you'll see that trend line. That trend line is going over time of your profession. Every one of those trend lines is on a downward trend, and those are looking at your non-technical skills scores. So as we get older as surgeons and become more experienced, all 12 scores on us go down. Now, not all 12 of these in this category, from looking at this, were all consistently significant, but there were 6 that were significantly different, and this isn't comparing them to the junior residents and them as junior faculty. The first one is considering options. Not surprising to me. I think we all get kind of set in our ways as we get older, and we have our way of doing things, but we really don't consider other options. Implementing and reviewing decisions, we're also weaker at that as we get older. Establishing shared understanding, that one really doesn't surprise me, but that one's there. The ones that really surprise me are these last 3, leadership. All 3 leadership categories we get worse as we get older as practicing surgeons. Setting and maintaining standards, supporting others, and coping under pressure. All 3 of those categories we were worse as we got more senior in our practice lives. Pretty interesting and pretty compelling data. These authors found this all unexpected and basically said that they think that experienced surgeons are not immune to deficiencies in non-technical skills, and that basically developmental programs should focus on non-technical skills regardless of the level of professional experience. And I would reemphasize that last sentence, regardless of the level of professional experience. And I firmly believe that it's beyond just our trainees, it's also those in practice. To this end, they worked on developing a faculty skill set and national guideline for how do we teach these non-technical skills. And once again, they came up with 7 different ones. They're in the top part of that box. But they kind of run the gamut from just understanding what we're talking about to how we implement it, to what it means, and then to what the limitations of those skill sets are in these patients and residents. So how does all this tie into the operating room, the bedside, the trauma bay, et cetera? There's a lot of focus on this, and there's a lot of focus on it from a perspective of teamwork. And this is from this month's Harvard Business Review, and there's a large amount of literature even in the business world about how you work on this teamwork concept and the non-technical skills, so to speak, from the world of business. And they focus a lot on the different players in your group. There are obviously very different personalities, how you intertwine those people and get the most out of them. And Clay alluded to a little bit of that. I'll talk about on her presidential address on Sunday, how we focus on this. When they started thinking about this, Yule et al., and Yule's one of the key people in all this literature, said we need to develop a leadership paradigm for those in the operating room, what that looks like. And they initially came up with 7 different broad categories of what they thought leadership skills should look like in the operating room. One was maintaining standards, another was managing tasks, making decisions, managing resources, directing and enabling, guiding and supporting, and then communicating and coordinating care, basically, from that perspective. And this was an early on version of this. They then, 2 years later, in 2013, came up with this study and said they're going to determine what these really should be, and they came up with 8 variables, and they called it the Surgeon's Leadership Inventory. And this is really a taxonomy of rating a surgeon's intraoperative leadership skills and how we perform in the operating room. You can see the ones on the far left are the ones I just mentioned. The far right are the ones they came up with ultimately. And that's what these are. Once again, a lot of these are the same, but there's some variability. They had an 8 in total: maintaining standards, making decisions, managing resources, directing, training, supporting others, communicating, and coping with pressure. So when you look at that, there's a lot of overlay between that and the not skill sets we're talking about from residents. And this is looking at surgeons' leadership indices in the operating room. They determined that there's great inter-rater reliability when you look at this from surgeon to surgeon and evaluator to evaluator. More importantly, when you take all this data and you look at the leadership skills of surgeons in the operating room and you see what it has the effect on team behavior, it's quite fascinating. And this was a study, and they took 3 different broad categories. One, they looked at the multiple leadership questionnaire, and this deals with transactional versus transformational leadership that Clay spoke of on Sunday. They looked at the surgical leadership index or inventory, and they looked at how the people in the operating room responded to them. And they looked at 3 broad categories, one being voice and modulation of voice and how the team performed. Another was looking at knowledge sharing. How do we share knowledge from one another? And those are the 2 biggest ones that they really focused on when you get down to it. The leadership styles they focused on the FLQ to start were transactional leaders. And really transactional leaders are very task-focused, and they're contingent reward and management by expectation. These leaders will often get the minimum required out of their team, and they'll meet the bar, but that's all they're going to do. They're never going to achieve more. And in this study, they actually had different videos they watched of surgeons and evaluated their transactional and transformational leadership skills. And this is very transactional. A scrub technician says, "What do you want to do with the specimen?" The surgeon simply responds, "We already discussed this." So you can imagine what you're going to get out of that circulator, that scrub tech from that point forward. They're probably not engaged in that operating room with you, and they probably really aren't a willing partner. Now, transformational leadership is very, very different, and it's looking at idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individual consideration. And leaders can actually really provide transformational leadership, really often get a lot more out of that operating room and their team than they should get out of it. So these people perform way above their expected performance levels. And this is just an example from the study, and it's a scenario that came through, and this is a real scenario. And the nurse is talking about the basin, and the doctor is talking about the basin, and then the scrub tech points out that there's a scrub student in the OR, and this is going to be a great case. At that point, the surgeon engages the scrub tech, talks to him, asks if they've ever seen this organ before or ever done surgery on this. They say no, and they kind of engage them further and say, "Well, I'm really happy I can be a part of this with you for your first big case." And I'll be honest, it sounds a little cheesy, but when you look at this from an overall perspective, you can imagine what you get out of that team. They're going to be much more involved and engaged in what you're doing in the operating room than that prior discussion we saw a minute ago. So what they did is they then looked, they had 5 surgeons they watched, and they did videos of these surgeons, and they followed them over the entire surgical procedure, and they looked at these different elements. They looked at transactional, transformational, and passive. I kind of left passive out because most of us as surgeons are not passive. And you can see the variables down there are pretty minimal when it comes to passive leadership. It's just not how we function. It's really not in our DNA. And these were all in highly complex surgical procedures that these folks were experts in. When you look at the transactional scores, you can see they're pretty standard across the board. They range from about 2.3 to 2.6, so not a lot of variability. But then you look at transformational leadership, and there's a wide discrepancy from 1.98 to 3.6. And that's really where people discerned themselves from one another, was their transformational leadership in the operating room. You can imagine those 2 scenarios I showed you. I can tell you Surgeon A was the first person, very transactional, 0 transformation. And then Surgeon E, who had the highest transformational score at 3.6, was the latter scenario I showed you. Interesting, when you read this paper, Surgeon A was in the operating room for 5 hours, 45 minutes, and 22 seconds before they ever asked the medical student what their name was. So you can imagine, if you're in that operating room, how engaged you are in the entire process. So there are a lot of things we can do from this perspective to really change how our team is functioning with us in the operating room. And I firmly believe it's not just the operating room, it's the trauma base, the ICU, et cetera. And I'll keep reiterating that. This was even more interesting to me, is then they looked and they said, well, how do these transactional and transformational roles play into the different elements of team behavior, being cooperation, information sharing, and voice? Transactional made no difference at all. Those who had transformational scores in the high range did quite well with information sharing, 300% more information sharing in that operating room than not without a transformational leader. And then voice modulation and voice performance, 542% increase in the operating room from that perspective. So really impressive changes just based on your behavior on how people are going to respond to you in the operating room and what you're probably going to get out of them at the end of the day. So in the routine case, you can imagine there's probably variances in how we perform from a leadership perspective. And this is what this study was hoping to look at was, are there factors that influence a surgeon's intraoperative leadership? And once again, they did this via video, and they looked at what they determined, what they said was PONR, point of no return. They looked at 5 surgical procedures and they said, what's the point of no return? Once you've done this, you can't go back. In a lap chole, they said once you've cut the duct, carotid endarterectomy, you've opened the carotid artery. Varicose veins, you've ligated the saprophymal junction. An aneurysm, you've opened the aneurysm. Hemicolectomy, stapled or cut across the colon. And inguinal hernia, you open the hernia sac. At that point in time, you're kind of already gone down the road. You can't turn back. What they did find is there's no difference in leadership styles pre and post point of no return. So we really don't vary much throughout the course of a surgery for the most part. It's pretty standard. They did identify that all of our leadership skills are directed towards our trainees. Very rarely do surgeons focus on other people in the operating room, not the anesthesiologists, not the scrub techs, the nurses. They're really focusing on their trainees more than anyone else in the room. This was even more interesting was, in the cases, and they weren't expecting this, but in cases where there was an event, an unexpected event, or an untoward event, what they found was that 2 of the behaviors actually got worse, and that's the gray bar. Training behaviors got worse, and then the other behavior that got worse from this perspective was supporting others. So you can imagine if you're in the operating room and something goes wrong, people need you to be training them, and they need your support, and that's when we fail the most. So we actually did a horrible job of actually getting better when they needed us at our most, and probably got worse from that perspective. So once again, you can imagine the effect that has on the team. And that's kind of what their conclusion was, is we don't really involve the entire team, we focus on the residents, and we do very much a one-size-fits-all. We maintain the same status quo throughout the surgical procedure in general, and it's only when there's an untoward event that we change, and quite frankly, we probably change for the worse from that perspective. So why does all this matter? And I alluded to this earlier. This was actually just a recent bulletin that came out from the ACS in the last couple of months, and it was Evolving Insights for Preventing Surgeon Errors. And this really goes back to the 2006 claims study that they had, and once again, you're not going to read all this, but what it does show that outcomes are based off behavioral or poor behavioral indicators. On this next one specifically, what you can see is on the left are all the different damaging events that occurred. And they could be a failure to diagnose, a misdiagnosis, failure to treat, a lot of things that we don't want to have happen to us as surgeons. What they did find is you're much more likely to have one of these failures if you have a behavioral failure. So if we perform poorly from a behavioral perspective, we're going into trouble, and it has nothing to do with our technical prowess. This is even more impressive to me is they looked at it from a preventability perspective. And I know we're kind of going away preventability and focusing on other options, but from a preventability perspective, when we have a failure in behavior, events are much more preventable. And that's both technical and non-technical. So it doesn't matter if it's a surgical technical error, it's much more preventable if we don't have a behavioral failure. So you can see there's a litany of things we can do from our perspective to try to decrease, improve these outcomes. And that's kind of what they concluded with. There's deficiencies in behavior and cognition, and these almost always result in errors. It's often not our technical prowess, like I said. So how do we affect all this? And I think one of the key things, we've talked about knots, we've talked about leadership, but I really think a big part of this is coaching, and how we involve coaching in the operating room, how we involve coaching from a rounding perspective, an ICU perspective, a shock room perspective. And the data on coaching is really becoming stronger and stronger. This was a study by Yule et al., and they're looking at coaching non-technical skills and how do you improve resident surgeons' performance in a simulated operating room. This has nothing to do with technical skills, purely non-technical skills. They kind of allude to it at the beginning, and I think this was interesting. I've never thought about this. I'm sure John Potts appreciates this, but the ACGM core competency really correlates nicely with knots. It's not just the professionalism elements, the communication, but all the different elements of the core competencies all relay nicely over to knots curricula when we really think about it. So there's a lot of overlay. The design of the study was quite simple. They took 16 senior residents, and on the top bar, they had 8, and on the bottom bar, they had 8. They did 5 cholecystectomies in the same day, back to back to back, and this is on a simulator, but they were all different simulations, so no 2 cases were the same. The top group got nothing. They did the gallbladder, had some time off, did another gallbladder, had some time off, et cetera, and they did all 5 gallbladders same day. The bottom group between each case got some non-technical skills training. So they got some pointers from a coach. The coach kind of helped guide them and help them understand what they might be able to do better from an overall perspective, and they evaluated these residents. What they found was in the blue bars is Operation 1, the green bars is Operation 2, and by providing simple coaching for 10 minutes between cases, they improved these folks' non-technical skills in the operating room via coaching. Pretty simple information we provided. They kind of give some examples about what they're talking about, and these are things I think we all do in the operating room, but probably not near enough. And it might be just talking to the residents about thinking ahead, think about what type of suture you're going to want for closure, or what kind of stapler you're going to want if you're doing a colon case. Speaking and talking to the anesthesiologist, letting them know what you're going to be doing so they can get ready for it. If you expect bleeding, let them, I'm not sure what happened there, but if you expect bleeding, let them go ahead and, we may have a little technical error, let them go ahead and do their thing from that perspective. But overall, what they're focusing on is, how do we interrelate with those other people, and how do we take that to the next level? I'll just keep talking. The next several slides also talk about coaching, and a lot of the coaching literature really comes from the University of Wisconsin and Caprice Greenberg. And Caprice has done a lot of work on coaching and looking at it. And at the University of Wisconsin, they've actually developed the Wisconsin Surgical Coaching Curriculum, I believe is what it's called. And they focus on how they coach people individually and coach them from a team perspective. On the coaching perspective, what they did, they came up with an entire paradigm of what that looks like. And they've drafted a model of how they coach their individuals. And coaching can take on many formats. It might be a format of one-on-one coaching. More and more, most places do video-based coaching because it's very challenging to have coaching from the perspective of one-on-one, time-wise, and things of that nature. So it's really kind of more video-based for a lot of institutions. They then identified some key tenets to being a successful coachee relationship and what that looks like from that perspective. The three key tenets they had, one was you had to have adequate rapport, so there had to be rapport between the two folks. And that was one of the key things is if you don't have adequate rapport, it's really never going to pan out. One was trustworthiness. You're going to have to trust one another, and you're going to have to be vulnerable to one another. And that goes for the coach and the coachee. If you don't have the vulnerability to trust one another, it's going to be very challenging for you to overcome any barriers you might have from a perspective. And the third thing was you really need to be able to set your goals ahead of time. So you need to know what the shared ownership or the shared expectations are. If you could achieve those three things as a coach and coachee relationship, you're much more successful from a coaching perspective. The last article we had on coaching was really kind of interesting. I was going to say it's from the best surgical journal there, the New Yorker. And the New Yorker from 2011, Atul Gawande had a great article. And he looked at coaching. And at that point, he had been about 9 to 10 years whenever you read the entire article. And he kind of says, if you think about it, when we look at it overall, athletes have coaches, singers have coaches, all these other professions have coaches. Why do we think as surgeons we don't need coaches? It's kind of fascinating, but we really don't think we need coaches, most people. And so his whole point was there's no reason to expect over time with evolving time, et cetera, in your profession, that you're not going to need more coaching or more skill set build up from that perspective. And there was one other study I alluded to in the discussion also that said exactly that. When they did interviews with all different parts of the operative team, it could be me as the surgeon, it could be the circulator, the scrub nurse, the scrub tech, anyone like that. When they did observations, they did interviews and said, what's going on from this perspective? Several things came out. First and foremost, people were very skeptical of coaching and surgery. And it was us as surgeons who were probably the most skeptical overall. They really didn't see the value in it, and they didn't see what it was going to add to their overall care of their patients from that perspective. The next thing they found out is they said that, and it kind of makes perfect sense, we have a very strong surgical culture. And part of that culture is we need to be independent, we need to have our autonomy, and we don't really want to be embarrassed in front of people. And so all those things almost go away from coaching when you look at it. I mean, coaching, you have to be vulnerable. You have to be accepting the fact that you might be challenged in a public format, things of that nature. So it's kind of getting to the fact that we probably really need coaching involved in our process, but we may not be ready to accept it from a professional perspective. So I think it really takes an effort from everyone in this room to go that route. Next, I was going to talk about what we're doing at Baylor briefly, and we developed something called the AIR program, which stands for Aviation Applications in Surgery. And over the past 6 months a year, we've had several interactions with American Airlines, and this comes from our chair, Todd Rosengart, but really looked at where are the opportunities between the aviation industry and surgery where there's really a lot of cross-pollination where we could learn. And we came up with 3 key concepts. And the goals really are to basically further our overall care of our patients and our professional development. The real goals obviously are to make us better professionals and also to encourage our overall happiness as surgeons, as faculty members, as residents, and things of that nature. The 3 things we came up with, one was a voluntary self-reporting online error system. It's very similar to what you have at a hospital, but it's really meant for us as the surgeons, it's meant for our residents, our trainees, Also for our clinical staff, so it's not even the doctors only, but the clinical staff to report any errors or near misses, basically. And these may be very different than what we think of from the hospital perspective. These are any type of error. At Baylor, we form over 5 different platforms between the VA, the private hospital, Ben Taub, the Heart Hospital, and the Children's Hospital. So you can imagine things are happening on all these platforms, and no one else knows what's going on at a different platform. What that does allow us to do, it allows us to look at all these under one roof, see what's going on, and then determine how can we better improve this. So we have a monthly oversight group that meets, they review all these data points, they bring them back to the individual platforms, how can we improve, and then the other platforms also learn what the issues might be at those other platforms out there. So very helpful from that perspective. Let's see if I can get us caught up to speed real quick. All right, sorry about that. So that's this right here, and I'm being daring by clicking on this just to show you. I may regret this in a second, but we'll do it anyway. And this is just what it looks like. It's actually very simple. It's meant to take about 2 to 3 minutes to fill this out. You can log in anywhere on any computer. We can actually even do it on your phone, and it's a very simple based system. You add a new report, and then it basically just takes you through a lot of drop-down menus. It has all the classic variables of what type of event this was, and you enter it, and then we can generate reports. And so we can look at it from an overall departmental perspective to appreciate what's going on. The second tenet we kind of took on was something what we're calling the jump seat program. So in aviation, it's kind of fascinating, and American Airlines talked to us a lot about this, is I may be the pilot, and Co may be my co-pilot, or vice versa. And what they have is they have a third pilot come in and sit with you. And that third pilot is just watching what you're doing. They're not partaking anything in the flight. They're just observing to see what you're doing. They're really making sure that you do what we say we do. And so we're actually going to start a jump seat program looking at the non-technical skills of surgeons in the operating room. And our plan is that all faculty are going to undergo this process at the 3 major platforms, being the private hospital, the VA, and Ben Taub. You'll have innumerable evaluations, and then we'll collate your data and look and see. You can imagine what this might look like. We're going to start with medical students serving as the jump seat observers. They'll probably watch about 30 to 60 minutes of a case and go from there. But I really think it's going to give us an opportunity to identify faculty who are really excelling and with some coaching can really become true leaders. And you're probably going to identify some faculty who are really struggling and with proper coaching can really become very competent, effective surgeons and not have an ineffective career path. And this is actually starting this spring. We're in the process of finalizing the entire process right now. The third component is what we're calling coaching the surgical leaders of today and tomorrow. And this is really to build a compelling, professionally executed leadership development program. We're partnering with Baylor Human Resources, and we're fortunate to have Rice University across the street, and we're partnering with them. They have the Door Institute for New Leaders, which is a large institute, heavily funded, where they provide leadership and opportunities for all their students. And it's really an interesting program. We're partnering with them in something called Coach Rice, and our goal is to have several of our faculty from each platform go and get formal coaching training through Coach Rice. Ideally, they'll come back and act as force multipliers. Our real goal is for that coaching culture to become the culture of Baylor, and specifically the Department of Surgery. So it's not something we're just learning on the fly, but it's how we practice and who we are. And that's going to start up this summer, and that's probably the one I personally am the most excited about. So in conclusion, I would say I think there are personal environmental factors that we deal with all the time in our lives that are very stressful. I would say from a surgical perspective, it really is these non-technical skills that lead to good clinical outcomes in practice, also leads to us being better professionals, and those 4 being situational awareness, decision-making, communication, teamwork, and then leadership. I would say that this paradigm needs to be lifelong learning. It can't be a one-time hit. It can't just be to our trainees. It really needs to be lifelong, our entire career. And thus, by promoting this, we'll ultimately improve our patient outcomes. It's my belief that coaching is truly an integral part of this. So once again, Clay, thank you for the opportunity, and I thank you guys for indulging me. Thanks.